A shotgun pressed to the back of a CEO's head, 37 people on their knees, and the only person in that room who knew exactly how to stop it was the man everyone had already dismissed. He wasn't wearing a suit. He didn't carry a badge. He came to transfer money for his daughter's school fees, but Mason Ryder had spent 11 years doing things most people can't imagine, in places most people will never know existed. Today, inside a downtown bank with no exits and no margin for error, those 11 years were about to matter more than anything else in the room. Like this video, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The line at First Meridian Bank moved the way all bank lines moved on a Thursday morning, slowly, indifferently, with the low hum of fluorescent lighting overhead and the faint smell of industrial floor cleaner rising from the pale marble tiles. 13 people stood ahead of Mason Ryder. He counted them without meaning to. It was an old habit, the kind that gets burned into you not through practice but through survival, the kind that keeps working long after you've decided you don't need it anymore. He shifted his weight to his left foot and checked his phone. 9:47 a.m. He had 40 minutes before he needed to pick up Lily from her orthodontist appointment across town. 40 minutes to transfer the enrollment deposit for Westfield Preparatory, $8,400, due by end of business today, non-refundable after 5 p.m. He'd scraped that money together across 8 months, picking up weekend shifts at the logistics company, skipping a car repair he still hadn't made, selling the guitar he hadn't played since 2019. He looked at the form in his hand. He'd filled it out 3 times because he kept second-guessing the routing number. A woman near the front of the line was arguing with a teller about a wire transfer that hadn't posted. Her voice had the particular edge of someone who wasn't used to being made to wait. Mason clocked her without staring. Mid-30s, tailored charcoal blazer, dark hair pulled back with the precision of someone who had a stylist on speed dial. She carried herself the way people do when they've spent years in rooms where their word ends arguments. He looked away. Not his business. The security guard by the door, a heavy-set man named Earl according to his name tag, was scrolling his phone with one thumb. The other teller, a young woman with box braids and a name tag that said Priya, was counting something under her breath. There were 2 surveillance cameras he could see from where he stood, one above the entrance, one angled at the teller windows, and probably a third in the back corridor out of sight. The rear exit was behind a door marked Staff Only near the left side of the service counter. The front entrance was plate glass, double door, with a pneumatic delay on the closer. He wasn't casing anything. He wasn't planning anything. This was just what his brain did in rooms, the same way some people automatically looked for the menu when they walked into a restaurant. 11 years in naval special warfare leaves marks that don't wash off, no matter how much you try to live like a regular person. Mason Ryder was 35 years old. He drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a daughter, who called him Dad, in the tone of someone who was simultaneously exasperated by him and entirely dependent on him, which was, he figured, the correct way for a 12-year-old to feel about her father. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Glenbrook. He cooked dinner 5 nights a week, packed lunches on school days, and helped with homework in subjects he barely remembered. He had 3 friends, 2 of them from his old unit, one of them a neighbor named Dave, who mostly talked about football. He did not think of himself as a hero. He did not think of himself as dangerous. He thought of himself as a man standing in a bank line who needed to finish this errand and get across town before noon. That was the morning he'd planned on having. What? The doors blew open at 9:51 a.m. Not figuratively. The pneumatic door mechanism actually took the hit. Someone had forced through the emergency release on the outer door, bypassing the sensor, and now 3 men were inside the lobby before Earl had even looked up from his phone. They moved fast and they moved loud, which Mason recognized immediately as a deliberate strategy. Noise creates panic, panic creates compliance, compliance creates control. The first man was the biggest, north of 6 feet, wearing a gray pullover with the hood up and a ski mask underneath it, carrying a sawed-off shotgun that he raised toward the ceiling and fired before anyone could process what was happening. The boom cracked through the marble and glass like a physical thing. People dropped. Screaming started. Priya backed away from her window. Earl reached for his hip and then froze when the second man, shorter, quicker, with a tactical vest and a Glock held sideways in his right hand, crossed the lobby in 4 strides, and shoved the gun into his face. "On the ground! Everybody on the ground right now!" The third man moved to the rear, cutting off the staff exit. He was the quietest of the 3, moving with a practiced economy that Mason noted immediately. He'd done this before, or something close to it. Mason went to the floor like everyone else, not because he was afraid, though fear was there. A low-frequency current running underneath everything, because only an idiot felt nothing in a situation like this, but because going to the floor was the correct tactical decision. You don't stand up in an active threat scenario until you know the full picture. You get down, you assess, and you do not telegraph. He pressed his left cheek against the cold marble and kept his hands visible. Around him, the bank had become a different place. The woman in the charcoal blazer, the one who'd been arguing about her wire transfer, was on her knees about 8 feet to his right, her composure stripped away in the span of about 4 seconds. She was breathing too fast. Her hands were shaking. There was a graze on her right palm where she'd gone down hard, and she was staring at it with an expression that suggested her brain hadn't fully caught up with what was happening to her body. A man in his 60s was praying quietly to himself. A young mother 2 spots down was shielding her toddler with both arms, the child crying into her shoulder. A bank employee, a young man in a button-down, had pressed himself against the base of the teller counter and closed his eyes. Mason counted. 37 people. 3 armed robbers, 2 visible weapons, the shotgun and the Glock. The third man in the rear might be carrying something under his jacket. He couldn't confirm. The front doors were the only viable exit. The staff corridor was now blocked. The big man, the one with the shotgun, walked down the line of kneeling hostages with the deliberate pace of someone establishing dominance. He was doing it for psychological effect, Mason knew. Make them feel watched. Make them feel chosen. That feeling of potential selection was almost more paralyzing than the gun itself. "Nobody moves," the big man said. His voice was controlled but rough around the edges, with a tension in it that wasn't quite confidence. "You do what we say, this is over in 20 minutes. You do something stupid, it's going to be a very bad day." 20 minutes was a lie, Mason thought. If they had a clean plan, they'd already be at the vault. The fact that they hadn't moved toward the vault yet meant either they didn't know the layout, or they were waiting on something, or they were improvising more than they wanted to admit. The shorter man, the one who'd taken Earl's gun and zip-tied his wrists, was moving through the lobby collecting phones. He had a canvas bag over one shoulder, and he worked efficiently, not making eye contact, just hands out, phones in. Mason gave his up without hesitation. He'd already noted that his phone had been recording since 42 seconds into the robbery. Force of habit. He kept the voice memo app on a short tap shortcut. He'd activated it in the first 3 seconds after the door blew open, when he went to his knees and made the motion look like he was catching himself. Probably nothing on there that mattered yet. But you didn't know what would matter. You collected everything and sorted it later. "What are you looking at?" Mason realized the big man had stopped in front of him. He looked up. The man was close enough that Mason could smell tobacco and sweat, could see the slight tremor in his left hand where it gripped the forestock of the shotgun, could read the micro-expressions behind the mask. Elevated heart rate, pupils dilated, the jaw was tight, and the breathing was shallow. This was a man running on adrenaline and a plan that was already starting to fray at the edges. Dangerous. Not because he was in control, because he wasn't, not entirely, and he knew it. "Nothing," Mason said. His voice was flat and cooperative. "Just trying to stay still?" The big man stared at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, then moved on. Vanessa Holloway had handled a hostile board takeover at 28 years old. She had negotiated a $70 million acquisition in a room where 3 men spent an hour trying to condescend their way through the term sheet. She had testified before a Senate subcommittee on data privacy regulation without notes, and she had done it in heels she'd bought the morning of the hearing because her regular pair broke on the subway platform. She was not a woman who lost her composure. She was losing her composure. Her knees hurt on the marble floor. The graze on her palms stung. Her blazer had a smear of dirt on the left sleeve from going down too fast, and that detail was the one her brain kept snagging on, which she recognized as her mind doing what minds do under extreme stress, latching onto something manageable because everything else was too large to hold. She had come to First Meridian to sign the papers on a business account restructuring. A 30-minute errand, her assistant had said, in and out. Now there was a man with a sawed-off shotgun at the front of the room and a man zip-tying people's wrists, and she was trying very hard to breathe through her nose and think through what she knew about hostage situations, which was, she was realizing, almost nothing. She'd read an article once. She remembered something about not making eye contact with aggressors, and something about trying to humanize yourself. She did not feel like herself. She glanced sideways at the man kneeling 2 feet to her left. Worn jeans, work boots that had seen better years, a flannel shirt that wasn't quite warm enough for the October morning. He'd come in from the line ahead of her, and she'd barely registered him because her attention had been on the teller and the wire transfer discrepancy. He looked like someone who did physical work for a living. Not a laborer exactly, but someone who used his body and didn't think much about it. He was very still. That was what she noticed first, and it was strange enough to pull at her attention even now. Everyone else in the room was doing something. Breathing too loud, crying quietly, pressing themselves against walls. The older man was praying. A woman near the far window was hyperventilating. This man was still. Not frozen still, not the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of someone who had decided what his body was going to do, and his body had agreed. He was watching the robbers, not with the obvious, wide-eyed stare of someone trying to memorize a face for a later police report. He was watching the way you'd watch something you were working out, tracking movement patterns, measuring distances. His eyes would settle on the big man for 3 or 4 seconds, then shift to the one collecting phones, then move briefly to the rear of the room. She almost asked him what he was doing. She didn't. Intent. 22 minutes into the robbery, the short man with the Glock found out about the secondary vault. Or rather, he didn't find out. He was told, because the assistant branch manager, a nervous man named Gerald, who had sweat through the back of his shirt in the first 5 minutes, had apparently decided that cooperation was his best survival strategy and had mentioned, while being questioned about the layout of the building, that there was a secondary safe deposit room on the lower level that held individual client boxes. This was not helpful information for Gerald. The big man, Mason had started thinking of him as lead for operational clarity, walked back to the center of the lobby with a look that suggested his calculation of the situation had just changed. He pulled out a phone, his own, not one of the collected hostage phones, and made a call that lasted 40 seconds. Mason couldn't hear every word from where he was kneeling, but he caught enough. Lower level. Client boxes. How long? Whoever was on the other end said something that made Led look at his watch. Change of plans, Lead announced to nobody in particular. We're going downstairs. The man who'd taken the rear position, Mason was calling him 3, moved toward the group of hostages near the window and started directing them toward the center of the room. He used the Glock to point, not aiming it, just using it as an extension of his gesture, which was its own kind of threatening because it suggested comfort. A man who's comfortable with a gun in his hand is more dangerous than a man who's scared of it. Pick a group, Led said, and he was looking at the hostages now the way you'd look at something you were going to use. 5 people. The rest stay up here. The shorter man, Mason was calling him 2, started walking the line. He stopped in front of Vanessa. You. 2 looked her over. You're coming. So Vanessa didn't move for a moment, and Mason could see the decision happening across her face. The instinct to argue fighting with the instinct to survive. Survival won, barely. Okay, she said. Her voice was steadier than Mason expected. 2 kept moving. He picked the branch manager, Gerald, which made sense. They'd need someone who knew the physical layout. He picked a middle-aged woman who'd been crying softly for 20 minutes but had stopped, which suggested either she'd found something under the fear or she'd simply exhausted herself. And then 2 walked past Mason once, twice, then stopped and came back. You too. Mason didn't react. He just stood up. As they were moved toward the stairwell, Mason was watching for 3 things: the spacing between the 3 armed men, the positioning of the hostages who were being left upstairs, and the layout of the corridor ahead. He was building a picture. Assembling the pieces the way you do when you've done enough of this kind of work to know that the picture, once complete, usually points toward exactly one viable option. He was also doing something else. As he rose from the floor, he nudged the canvas bag that Tu had set down while collecting phones. Not aggressively, just a shift of his boot. The bag moved maybe 8 inches, putting it behind the corner of the service counter rather than in the open floor space where it had been. Tu glanced back. The bag wasn't in his eye line anymore. He didn't notice. On the way past the seating area near the window, Mason's right hand trailed along the back of a chair and shifted it forward, about a foot into the main walking path between the lobby entrance and the teller windows. The movement was so ordinary, the unconscious gesture of someone steadying themselves, that even Vanessa, walking 2 feet ahead of him, didn't register it. In the stairwell, as they descended, he glanced up at the emergency lighting panel on the wall. Battery backup. He made a note of its location. He had to admit to himself, a long way from being the man standing in line, waiting to transfer his daughter's school fees. Lily, $8,400, non-refundable after 5 p.m. He needed this to be over before 5 p.m. The lower level was cooler and less finished than the main floor. Exposed conduit on the ceiling, utility shelving along the left wall, the ambient noise of what was probably an HVAC system running somewhere deeper in the building. The safe deposit room was at the end of a short corridor behind a heavy door with a dual key system. Gerald fumbled with his key twice before getting it right, which seemed to irritate Led enough that he put a hand on the back of the man's neck. Gerald's hands shook worse after that. Inside the room was a wall of metal boxes from floor to ceiling on both sides, with a narrow aisle running through the center. Somewhere between 300 and 400 individual boxes, Mason estimated. Standard bank issue. Open them, Led said. Gerald looked stricken. I can't open individual boxes without the client's key. Each one needs 2 keys simultaneously, the client's and the bank's master, and even then, I don't need a tutorial. Lead pressed the shotgun against Gerald's chest. Find a way. Gerald began explaining with the patient, terrified voice of someone who had already accepted that this was probably the worst day of his life, that the bank's master key was kept in the operations room upstairs, and that even with it, each box required the individual client key, and that there was no override mechanism short of physically drilling out the lock. Lead did not look pleased. Vanessa had positioned herself near the wall, arms crossed over her chest. She was watching Gerald, not Mason. She had, Mason thought, good instincts. She'd correctly identified Gerald as the focal point of tension in the room, the variable most likely to determine what happened next. But she wasn't watching Tu, who had taken a position near the door and was doing the subtle, restless movement of someone whose patience was running out. Not dangerous yet, but getting there. 3 wasn't in the room. He'd stayed upstairs. Mason stood near the center of the narrow aisle, 3 boxes from the back wall, and calculated distances. Led was 7 feet to his left. Tu was 11 feet behind him at the door. The ceiling was 8 feet overhead. The aisle was approximately 22 inches wide, enough to move but not enough to pivot freely, which mattered if it came to that. He thought about Lily again. Her appointment was at 11:30. If he wasn't there, they'd call his number, which was currently in a canvas bag upstairs. The orthodontist's office had his neighbor Dave listed as an emergency contact. Dave would figure out something was wrong by mid-afternoon. Stop it, he told himself. Work the problem. He looked at Vanessa. She glanced at him, then away, then back. Something had shifted in her expression. She'd been watching him in the lobby. He'd noticed that. She was smart enough to have picked up on something, even if she didn't know what she was seeing. He tilted his head, barely, a small, deliberate movement. Her eyes sharpened. He moved his gaze to Tu, then back to her. Then down, very slightly, to the floor near Tu's feet, where a small metal cart on casters had been left by the maintenance staff. Vanessa's eyes went to the cart, then back to Mason. Her brow was tight, uncertain. She didn't know what she was supposed to do with that. He shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Not yet. She kept her eyes on him. The upstairs vault, Mason said. Everyone looked at him. Lead turned from Gerald slowly, like a man who's just heard something unexpected and isn't sure yet whether to be interested or angry. "There's a second vault on this floor," Mason said. "Not the deposit boxes. A liquidity reserve vault. Cash holdings." "Who are you?" Lead said. "I used to work in bank security." This was not entirely untrue. He'd done private security consulting for 16 months after his discharge, and 2 of those months had involved a financial institution in Dallas. He'd learned enough to be dangerous in a conversation like this one. Lead looked at him. Mason kept his expression even. Not defiant, not fearful. Just a man offering information. "If you're lying, I'm telling you there's cash on this floor because I'd rather you take cash and leave than spend another hour down here while the police figure out where you've gone." He paused. "The longer this takes, the worse your options get. You know that." A silence. 2 had come away from the door slightly. Gerald had stopped trying to explain the key mechanism and was simply watching with the expression of a man who has decided that someone else's plan is better than his own. "Show me," Lyd said. Mason nodded and started walking. He didn't know if there was a reserve vault on this floor. He was buying time, and he was going to need every second of it. He'd spotted the emergency call panel in the stairwell on the way down. A bypass alarm connected directly to the city's emergency dispatch, separate from the main security system. It required a 7-digit staff code to arm, but disabling the safety lockout took only a 4-digit bypass that defaulted to the installation year for most banks of this age and build spec. He'd read the emergency response manual for a building of similar vintage in Dallas. He was betting on institutional inertia, on the fact that banks don't change default codes as often as they should. He was going to find out if that bet paid off. He led them back toward the stairwell. Upstairs, the remaining 32 hostages were sitting in clusters under 3's watch. The middle-aged woman near the windows had started a quiet conversation with the young mother and her toddler, something low and steady, probably soothing nonsense, the kind of instinctive kindness that shows up in people during collective crisis in a way it rarely does on an ordinary afternoon. Earl, the security guard, was zip-tied to a chair near the entrance. He was watching 3 carefully, not with any immediate intent. He was injured, Mason didn't know how badly, and zip ties at the wrists meant his options were limited, but with the focused attention of a man who hadn't fully given up. Mason filed that away. The canvas bag was still behind the counter, where he'd nudged it. 3 hadn't noticed it was missing from the open floor. The chair he'd shifted was still in the middle of the walking path. He walked back through the lobby toward the stairwell door, with Led immediately behind him, and 2 flanking Vanessa 5 feet back. And as he passed the counter, he took the 2 extra seconds to glance down at the bag and confirm it was still there. It was. He went through the stairwell door. The emergency panel was on the left wall, just as he remembered. A gray metal housing, maybe 8 by 10 inches, with a locking cover plate. He'd need to get the cover open without Led noticing, get his fingers on the keypad, and hope the default code was still valid. He had maybe 30 seconds before Led would want to know why they were in the stairwell instead of a vault. He turned to face Led. "I have to be straight with you," Mason said. Led's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means what I just said." Mason kept his voice level. "I gave you the story about the reserve vault because you were about to do something you couldn't take back in there, and I needed to buy us some time." The shotgun came up. "Are you out of your... I'm also telling you this because the first police units arrived in the parking structure 40 seconds ago." This was a guess. A calculated one. 17 minutes had passed since the robbery started. Average dispatch time for a bank alarm in this district, based on what he knew of similar jurisdictions, was 11 to 13 minutes. Unit staging before entry took another 5 to 8. He was within the margin. Lyd stared at him. "You have a window," Mason said. "Small one. You take it right now, or that window closes and this becomes something very different." 2 had grabbed Vanessa's arm. She didn't cry out, just set her jaw and went rigid. "He's stalling," 2 said. I know he's stalling." Lyd's voice had gone cold and flat in a way that was more frightening than the shouting had been. "And I'm going to blow his head off and take the woman as a walkout." Mason had known this was one of the likely outcomes when he started talking. He'd been counting on it making Led move toward him. When Led stepped forward with the shotgun, He was bringing himself inside the range at which the weapon was most effective. He was also bringing himself within Mason's reach. Mason had 0.6 of a second. He used them. Was it? The first thing Vanessa registered was the sound. Not a gunshot, because there was no gunshot, but something fast and close and violent that she couldn't organize into a sentence. She felt Tu's grip disappear from her arm. She stumbled left, hit the wall, caught herself. When she got her eyes up, Mason had the shotgun. Lead was on the floor, face down, one arm bent in a direction it was not intended to go. He was conscious but not doing anything useful about it. Tu was on his knees holding his wrist. The Glock was on the floor. It had taken, by Vanessa's estimate, less than 5 seconds. It might have been 3. She had never in her life seen a human being move like that. She had also never, she realized, noticed how still Mason had been keeping himself all morning. Not in the way she'd assumed, not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of a man conserving energy for a moment he'd been building toward since the doors blew open. "Don't move," Mason said to Led, and his voice was completely calm. Not adrenaline rough, not shaking, calm the way a carpenter's voice goes calm when he's doing something he's done 10,000 times and the muscle memory has taken over from conscious thought. He looked at Vanessa. "The panel on the wall, gray metal cover. I need you to pull the release tab at the bottom." She moved to the panel. Her hands were shaking. She found the tab, pulled it. The cover swung open. 4 digits, he said. Try 2007. She keyed it in. A yellow light blinked twice, then a steady green. Somewhere in the building, something went live. "What did that do?" she asked. Sent a distress signal directly to emergency dispatch. He was watching both men on the floor. Tu was doing the math on the Glock and deciding the math wasn't good. "It'll take about 90 seconds for them to confirm it's not a test signal, and then they'll move." "What about upstairs? 3 is still—" "I know." He looked at her. "Are you injured?" "No." "Can you run?" She looked at him. Tailored blazer, marble dust on one knee, heels she'd worn because she had a signing this morning. "Yes," she said. "Good." He glanced at the stairwell door. "Then let's go tell 3 that his friends are detained and his exit is closed, because I'd rather he surrender than have anyone else get hurt trying to stop him." She stared at him. "You're going to walk up there and tell an armed man to give up?" "More or less." "Based on what? What's your leverage?" "He's alone. There are 32 people up there, and in about 80 seconds this building is going to have 12 tactical officers outside it." He looked at her steadily. "That's a lot of leverage." Vanessa Holloway had spent her entire career building leverage in rooms where other people held the power. She understood it in her bones, the way it moved, the way it shifted, the way it required you to understand the other person's fear better than they did themselves. She understood, in that moment, that this man, this quiet, worn clothes, school fees man, understood leverage in a way that had nothing to do with boardrooms or balance sheets, and that his version of it was the kind that actually determined whether people lived or died. "Okay," she said, and they went upstairs. 3 surrendered. Not immediately. There was a minute and a half of him pointing the gun at various people and making the kind of threats that Mason recognized as the last performance of someone who's already decided they're done but hasn't found the door yet. Mason talked to him the whole time, not urgently, not dramatically, just steadily, the way you'd talk to someone who'd gotten themselves somewhere they couldn't figure out how to get back from. He didn't beg. He didn't negotiate promises. He just kept talking, because in his experience, which was considerable, most people who are pointing a gun at somebody don't actually want to pull the trigger. They want someone to give them a reason not to. Mason gave him a reason. 3 put the gun down at the 12-minute mark. He sat on the floor with his hands visible and said nothing else. 37 seconds later, the front doors opened and the tactical unit came through in a formation that Mason found, in the uninvested part of his brain that was always watching, reasonably professional. The crisis was over. In the long wait that followed, because there was always a long wait, statements to give and people to account for and logistics to untangle, Vanessa sat against the wall near the window and watched Mason answer a detective's questions with the economical patience of a man who's given a lot of debriefs and has no interest in making them dramatic. The young mother's toddler had fallen asleep against the woman's shoulder. The man in his 60s was sitting with his hands in his lap, very quiet. Earl had been helped to a chair, and someone had found a first aid kit, and he was holding an ice pack to his temple with the look of a man who had opinions about how his morning had gone. Vanessa had given her statement. She'd described what she'd seen, which was less than she'd understood, which was less than what had actually happened. She knew that. She'd spent 3 hours in a room where a plan was being built in plain sight, and she'd caught maybe a third of it in real time. She looked down at her hand. The graze was nothing. It would heal in a week. She looked at Mason. He told the detective about the emergency panel code, about the positioning of the robbers, about the timeline he'd been tracking. He gave it all matter-of-factly, without inflection, as if he were describing a project completion timeline. The detective kept stopping to ask follow-up questions because the information kept being more detailed and more operationally relevant than the detective had expected. At one point, the detective said, "You said you used to work in security. What kind of security?" Mason said, "Government." The detective waited for more. Mason didn't offer it. She wanted to know his name. She wanted to know who he was, where he'd come from, how a man with worn boots and a bank transfer form in his pocket had walked through this morning the way he had. She was used to understanding people quickly. It was a professional requirement, reading the room, reading the person. She was good at it, but she'd read Mason Ryder wrong from the first moment she'd laid eyes on him, and that almost never happened to her. It bothered her. Not in a bad way. In the way that things bother you when they've expanded your sense of what's possible in a direction you weren't expecting. His phone was still in the canvas bag with everyone else's. One of the officers was going through it, and when Mason finally got his back, he looked at the screen and his face changed slightly. Not dramatically, just a small compression around the eyes, a slight tightening at the corners of his mouth. He dialed a number immediately. "Dave," he said when it picked up. "Hey, I know. Is Lily with you?" "Okay." A pause. "Tell her I'm fine. Tell her I just got held up." He listened. "No, I mean literally held up, like in a bank." "Yeah." Another pause, longer, and something in his expression shifted again. Something softened in a way that hadn't been there in the last 2 hours. "Yeah, I know. Tell her I'll be there by 2. She can have the leftover pasta for lunch." He listened. "Tell her the pasta, Dave. She'll say she wants the good cereal, but the pasta is better. She knows where the microwave—" He stopped. "Okay, thanks." He hung up. He stood there for a moment with the phone in his hand, and he looked like a different person than the one who'd quietly disarmed a man with a shotgun in a stairwell. He looked like a father who'd spent a frightening morning away from his kid and was starting to breathe normally again. He looked, Vanessa thought, completely and entirely human. She got to her feet. "Hey," she said. He turned. "I'm Vanessa Holloway." She held out her hand, the one without the graze on it. He looked at it for a second, then shook it. "Mason Ryder." "I'm aware of that," she said. "I asked one of the officers while you were giving your statement." A slight raise of one eyebrow. "Okay. I want to say thank you." She held his gaze. "I know that probably sounds insufficient for what happened in there." "It sounds fine," he said. No false modesty in it, no deflection. Just a direct response to a direct statement. She found that she liked it. "I'd like to buy you coffee," she said, "or lunch, or whatever. I have to get to my daughter." He said it without apology, just as a fact. "She's been waiting at her orthodontist." "Right, of course." Vanessa nodded. "Another time, then." He looked at her for a moment in a way that she couldn't entirely read, not with any particular interest or intent, just with the same measured attention he'd been giving everything all morning, like he was noting something and deciding what to do with it. "Sure," he said. "Another time." And then he walked out of First Meridian Bank into the October morning, past the news vans already setting up on the sidewalk, past the tactical team packing its equipment back into vehicles, past the yellow police tape and the curious crowd gathered behind it, without stopping or turning or giving anyone outside any indication that he was anything other than a man who needed to get somewhere. Vanessa watched him go. Behind her, the detective was asking if she had any further questions. The branch manager, Gerald, was sitting on the floor with his jacket off, looking at nothing. The overhead lighting hummed the way it had when she'd first walked in this morning, which felt like it belonged to a different version of her life. She thought about the way Mason had said, I know when she'd told him the panel code worked, not with satisfaction or relief. Just I know, as if the outcome had never been seriously in question, as if his years of training and his quiet morning and his daughter's orthodontist appointment and the $8,400 for Westfield Preparatory had all converged here, in this particular building, on this particular Thursday, for no reason he could have predicted and no reason he would have chosen. She thought about the way he'd talked 3 down from the ledge. No heroes, no speeches, just a steady human voice giving someone a reason to make the right choice. She thought about how she'd looked at him in the line and registered nothing but worn clothes and an ordinary morning and moved on. She would not make that mistake again. The news vans were still parked outside First Meridian when Vanessa got into the back of her car at 1:14 p.m. Her driver, a quiet man named Terrence, who had worked for her company for 6 years and knew better than to ask unnecessary questions, handed her a bottle of water without comment and pulled away from the curb. She drank half of it in one go, which was not something she normally did, and then she sat with the bottle in her lap and looked out the window at the city moving past. The lunch crowds, the delivery trucks, the ordinary, unremarkable Thursday that everyone outside that building was still having. And she thought about the chair. That was the detail she kept returning to, not the shotgun, not the stairwell, not the moment the tactical unit came through the front doors. The chair. The way Mason had shifted it as they were being moved toward the lower level, the easy trailing gesture of his right hand, the absolute naturalness of the movement. She'd been standing 2 feet from him when he did it, and she'd registered nothing more than a man steadying himself in a stressful moment. She was supposed to be perceptive. She read rooms for a living. She'd missed it completely. Her phone had 93 notifications and 4 missed calls from her communications director, who had been monitoring news coverage and was, based on the preview of the first text, experiencing a significant level of professional anxiety. Vanessa scrolled past all of it. She answered one call, her CFO, and told him the business account restructuring was postponed and she'd reschedule through her assistant. She said she was fine in the tone she used when she meant, "I'm functional and we're not going to talk about this further," which he recognized and accepted. She put the phone down. What she could not put down was the image of Mason Ryder walking out of that building and disappearing around a corner with the same unremarkable ease he'd walked in with. No interview. No moment for the cameras. His daughter was waiting at the orthodontist. 37 people were alive and uninjured because of what he'd done, and he'd left like a man who had somewhere else to be. She didn't know what to do with that. What? 2 days later, the story had moved through the news cycle the way news cycles moved, fast at first, then softening at the edges as the next thing came along. The police had named the 3 men in custody. The bank had issued a statement. Priya, the teller, had given a brief interview that ran on 2 local channels. Earl, the security guard, had a cracked cheekbone and was apparently being considered for a commendation. The man who had actually ended the hostage situation was not mentioned in any official release. Vanessa asked her head of corporate security, a former FBI field agent named Hartley, why. Witness asked for anonymity, Hartley said. Pretty standard when someone's cooperated with police in a case that's still active. They honor it. He gave a full statement. Detailed as anything I've seen from a civilian, apparently. Timeline, positioning, tactical decisions, the whole thing. The detective who ran the debrief called it the most organized hostage account he'd taken in 20 years. Hartley paused. He also told the detective he had no interest in being identified publicly. Vanessa thought about that. Can you find out who he is? Hartley gave her the particular look he reserved for requests that were technically possible but professionally complicated. What kind of finding out? Background. Service record if there is one. Current situation, nothing invasive. She caught his expression. Professional curiosity. You were in the building with him for 3 hours. I know his name. I don't know anything else. She set her coffee down. He told the detective he used to work in government security. That's a wide category. It is, Hartley agreed. He looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded. Give me a day. Hartley gave her a file the following afternoon. Mason Allen Ryder, born 1989, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Enlisted in the United States Navy at age 18. Advanced through basic underwater demolition training, Bud/S, and was assigned to SEAL Team 6, the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, in 2012. 11 years of active service, 4 combat deployments, classified operations in 3 separate theaters. Decorated twice, the Navy Commendation Medal with Combat Valor and the Bronze Star. She had to read that part twice. Medically discharged in 2021, following injuries sustained during a training exercise that Hartley's notes described as classified, and she didn't press on. The medical discharge was honorable and full benefit, which meant whatever happened to him had been serious enough that the Navy had made sure he was taken care of. He had a daughter, Lily Ann Ryder, age 12. Her mother, a woman named Clara, had died in 2019 from a cerebrovascular hemorrhage, a brain bleed, sudden, no warning. Lily had been 6 years old. Mason had been deployed when it happened. He made it home in time for the funeral and had requested a compassionate reassignment to stateside training duties, which had been granted. He'd left the Navy 2 years later and moved to Glenbrook. He was currently employed as a route coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company called Caro Freight Solutions. His salary, which Hartley had sourced through employment verification records, and which she hadn't asked him to include but which she wasn't surprised he had, was $41,000 per year before taxes. There was a note at the bottom of the file in Hartley's handwriting. No social media presence, no debt, no criminal record. Has a 2009 F-150 with a failing alternator according to a service record from a shop on Cressler Avenue. Custody of daughter is sole, no legal complications. Vanessa closed the file. She sat with it for a long time. She'd known success stories of different kinds. People who'd built things, people who'd accumulated things, people who'd turned personal adversity into professional narrative in the way that her world often required, and sometimes rewarded. She knew how to evaluate a person's history for the qualities that mattered in a boardroom or in a negotiation. She was not sentimental about it. This was different. This was a man who had, by any measurable standard, given more than most people were ever asked to give. He'd given his body to service. He'd given his presence to his country during the years when his wife was alive and his daughter was small, and he was somewhere he couldn't be named doing something he couldn't describe. He'd come home to a child who'd lost her mother and a life that had contracted itself down to 2 bedrooms and $41,000 and a school enrollment deposit he'd been saving for 8 months. And then one Thursday morning, he'd walked into a bank to handle a routine errand, and when the room went wrong, he hadn't looked for an exit. He'd started building a plan. She wasn't sure she'd ever met anyone like that. She wasn't sure she'd been looking for the right things before. Tut. She called the number Hartley had found. It rang 4 times, which was long enough for her to wonder if she'd made a mistake, and then he picked up. Yeah. Mason Ryder? A pause. Who is this? Vanessa Holloway, from the bank. A longer pause. Then, not unkindly, how'd you get this number? I have a head of security who used to work for the FBI. She kept her voice even. I wanted to make sure you were okay, and I wanted to follow up on the coffee I offered. I'm okay, he said. Then, after a beat, you didn't have to do the background check to ask about coffee. She felt the corner of her mouth pull up slightly. No, but I wanted to understand what happened in there, and you weren't available for questions at the time. I was answering questions at the time, just not yours. Fair point. She leaned back in her chair. I'm not going to apologize for being curious about who just saved my life. That's my right as the person whose life was saved. A sound on his end. She couldn't quite tell if it was amusement or resignation. What do you want to know? I want to have a conversation, in person, preferably. Nothing formal. Another pause. She had the sense he was thinking about this in the same careful way she'd watched him think about everything in that building. Not slow, just deliberate. Not stalling, just not wasting the consideration the moment was owed. There's a place on Morrow Street, he said finally. Does coffee and sandwiches. Nothing fancy. That works fine. Saturday, 11 o'clock. I'll be there. The place on Morrow Street was called Dunmore's, and it had been there long enough that the sign out front had the particular faded confidence of a business that had never needed to reinvent itself. Small, 10 tables, the kind of coffee that came from a proper machine and not a pod. Mason was already there when Vanessa arrived. sitting at a corner table with a mug in front of him, wearing a dark flannel jacket over a gray shirt. He stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected. They shook hands again. His was still calloused, still dry. She thought about the fact that the last time they'd shaken hands, she'd been standing in a bank with marble dust on her knee. "You're on time," he said. "I'm always on time." She sat down, pulled off her coat. "You're early." "Old habit." The coffee came. She ordered the same thing he had, black, no modifications, without looking at the menu, partly because she actually took her coffee black, and partly because she didn't want to turn this into a scene about her being a person who had complicated preferences. She'd spent enough professional breakfasts in the last decade, making deliberate choices about not performing her own status. For the first few minutes, they talked about nothing consequential. The news coverage. The fact that Gerald, the branch manager, had apparently given an interview to a local radio station. The way the tactical team had entered the building, she'd mentioned she thought it was well organized, and he'd said it was okay in a tone that made her think his standard was considerably higher than hers. Then she put her mug down and looked at him. "Why didn't you say anything when the robbery started? You knew immediately what was happening and what you were capable of. Why did you wait as long as you did?" He didn't look thrown by the question. Because acting too early means acting without enough information. You don't know how many there are, you don't know the weapons, you don't know if there's someone outside, you don't know if anyone's trigger happy or on something. He wrapped both hands around his mug. 45 seconds of watching gives you more than enough to build with. Acting in the first 5 seconds is how people get shot. How do you stay calm enough to watch? "I've been in worse rooms." He said it simply, without bravado. When you've been in genuinely worse rooms, a bank robbery sits differently. It's bad. It's not the worst thing I've seen. She thought about what Hartley's file had contained. 2 combat deployments, a Bronze Star, the things that were classified and the things that weren't, and the distance between the man sitting across from her now and the person who'd lived through those years. "You have a daughter," she said. He looked at her. "Yeah. She's 12. She'll be 13 in February. She's going to be insufferable about it." Something shifted in his expression, something that loosened slightly, the way a face does when a person stops choosing what they show and just shows it. She's already planning the party. It involves laser tag, which she's never played, and a playlist she's been building since March. Vanessa smiled at that, genuinely. "My parents forgot my 13th birthday," she said. "They weren't bad people. They were just very busy, and I was the kid who seemed like she had everything handled." "Did you?" "More or less, which is probably why nobody thought to check." He nodded. Not with pity, just recognition. The kind of nod that means I understand that particular dynamic. "What was her name?" Vanessa asked. "Your wife." A beat. "Clara." He didn't tense up the way she'd half expected. "She was a teacher, 4th grade. She was terrible at being early to anything, which drove me insane when I was stateside, and I would give a lot now to have that particular argument one more time." He paused. "Lily has her laugh. That same exact laugh. Sometimes it catches me off guard still." She didn't say she was sorry. He'd heard that enough to last several lifetimes, she imagined. "What's she like?" "Lily." 12 going on 35. She's doing a science project right now on ocean thermal energy conversion, which is not something I would have been capable of pronouncing at her age, let alone explaining. She's been correcting my vocabulary since she was 9. A brief, real smile crossed his face. "She asks too many questions, she doesn't sleep enough, and she has very strong opinions about which movies are worth watching twice. I have no idea where she got any of it." Vanessa thought about a man who drove a 2009 truck with a failing alternator and scraped together $8,000 over 8 months for a school deposit, who found time to pack lunches and supervise science projects and manage orthodontist appointments while working a logistics job, who went home every night to a child who needed him and woke up every morning to do it again without calling it sacrifice, because to him it simply wasn't. It was just Tuesday. "You could have been in a completely different position," she said, "professionally, with your background." He shrugged. "I could have been a lot of things. Private security, consulting. The experience you have, there are firms that would have hired you immediately out of discharge." "I know." He picked up his mug. I didn't want that. I wanted something regular, something that let me be home for dinner. He looked at her over the rim. Lily had already lost one parent to a job that required everything. I wasn't going to be the second one. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 80-hour weeks she'd put in for 7 years, the relationships she'd let drift, the particular loneliness of building something impressive at the cost of most of everything else, and then standing on top of it and noticing, in the small hours, that the view was large but the company was limited. I have a question for you, Mason said. Go ahead. Why are you here? Not, he paused, choosing the words carefully. Not the official reason, the personal one. She didn't answer immediately, which was unusual for her. She was very good at answers. I spent 3 hours in a room where I thought I understood what was happening, she said finally. I thought I knew what I was seeing, who was dangerous, what the options were. I was wrong about almost all of it. She looked at the coffee in her hands. In my professional life, I'm rarely wrong that thoroughly and that silently. Usually when I miss something, I miss it loudly enough to feel it on the way past. She looked up. You were invisible. You were invisible. And you were also the only person in that room who knew what to do. I want to understand how that works. He thought about it. Most people think being capable means being obvious about it. It doesn't. Being obvious gets people killed. He set his mug down. The most dangerous thing I ever learned was how to be still. How to be the least interesting person in the room until the moment you can't be anymore. That's a hard skill in a world that rewards people for being noticed. Yeah, well, he looked at her without irony. The world rewards a lot of things that aren't actually worth much. She didn't argue. She was at some level in the business of being noticed. She'd been noticed since she was 24 years old and had built a company in a space where nobody expected her to. She'd been on magazine covers and testified before committees and given keynote addresses and curated the version of herself that got things done in a world that was still working out how to hold all the different things she was. She'd never spent 45 seconds being deliberately invisible and trusted herself to know when to stop. I want to offer you a position, she said. Executive Security Director. Holloway Group is operating across 11 cities. We have about 400 employees and a physical office footprint that has, frankly, inadequate protective protocols. She held his gaze. You designed the security architecture from the ground up. Full salary, benefits, flexibility around your daughter's schedule. He looked at her steadily. How much of this is gratitude and how much of it is practical? She appreciated the directness. 60-40. 60 practical, 40 gratitude. You can decide which way that cuts. He was quiet for a long moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. The same quality of stillness he'd had in the bank, that deliberate internal assembly of information before output. I appreciate it, he said finally. Genuinely. He met her eyes. No. She blinked. It came out faster than she meant it to. No? I have a daughter who needs a father who's present, not one who's managing executive security for a company across 11 cities. That's not a regular job. He said it without apology, just as a fact. I have a regular job. It's not glamorous. It keeps the lights on, and I'm home by 6. She sat with that for a moment. The refusal was so clean and so absent of performance that she found it almost disorienting. She was used to people wanting things from her, or at minimum pretending they didn't while they did. Mason Ryder simply didn't want what she was offering, and he'd said so. You just turned down a significant salary increase, she said. I turned down a life I don't want. He wasn't unkind about it. There's a difference. She sat back in her chair and looked at him. Outside the window of Dunmore's, Morrow Street was doing its ordinary Saturday morning business. Someone walked past with a dog. A kid on a bike cut through a puddle and got his sneakers wet and didn't seem to care. What if it were different, she said. He looked at her. Different how? I don't know yet. She was being honest, which was its own departure from her normal approach to these conversations. I'm still working that out. She picked up her coffee. But I think you're a person who makes things that are broken work right, and I think that's something you could do at a larger scale if the structure around it was correct. She paused. I'm not going to stop thinking about that. That's your business, he said. Not dismissively, just acknowledging a fact. It is, she agreed. They sat with their coffee for another 40 minutes. The conversation moved into less pointed territory. She asked about Westfield Preparatory, and he explained Lily's aptitude scores and the scholarship component, and the fact that she was nervous about starting somewhere new, which was the thing he was actually most preoccupied with, more than the tuition. She told him about her own experience of being the new person in rooms that hadn't been built for her. He listened in the way people listen when they're actually listening, not constructing a response. When they left, he held the door open without making a thing of it. On the sidewalk, the October air had the sharp particular smell of a city getting ready for colder weather. "I'll pay for the coffee," she said. "I already did," he said. She looked at him. "When?" "When I got there." He had his hands in the pockets of his jacket. Didn't want to have that negotiation at the end. She found that she couldn't tell if she was annoyed or amused. She landed somewhere between both. "Fine. Take care of yourself, Vanessa Holloway." "You too, Mason Ryder." She watched him walk back to wherever he'd parked the truck. He walked the same way he did everything. Without hurry, without performance, taking up exactly the space he needed, and none more. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than necessary. The coffee had been good. The conversation had been better. She'd gotten what she came for, which was an understanding of who he was, and she'd come away with something she hadn't expected, which was the sense that she'd been asking the wrong questions about what success was supposed to look like, and that this unremarkable man with his regular job and his science project daughter and his failing alternator had something figured out that a great many more impressive people did not. She walked to her car. The proposal she'd made to him, executive security director, was already dissolving in her mind, replaced by something she couldn't quite articulate yet, something bigger than a title and a salary, something that would actually be worth his time. She just needed to figure out what it was. 3 weeks after the bank robbery, Mason was at his kitchen table at 7:15 in the morning, helping Lily with the bibliography for her ocean thermal energy paper, when his phone buzzed with an email from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line said, "A different kind of proposal." He finished explaining citation format to Lily. She kept putting the date in the wrong place, which was an argument they'd had twice already and which she was determined not to lose on principle. And then he opened the email. It was from Vanessa. It was 3 paragraphs long. No preamble, no pleasantries. Just an idea, laid out the way she'd apparently laid out every idea she'd had in 20 years of building things. Clear, direct, and large enough to require a second read. He read it. Then he read it again. Lily looked up from her bibliography. "Dad, you're making a face." "I'm not making a face." "You're doing the thing where you look like you're calculating something." He set the phone down. "Eat your eggs." "I already ate my eggs." She tilted her head. "Who's the email from?" "Someone I know." "From where?" He looked at her. 12 years old, Clara's laugh, correcting his vocabulary since she was 9. She had a smear of ink on her left wrist from where she'd been writing with the pen held too tightly, and her hair was still half undone from the night before, and she was looking at him with the particular focused attention of a child who had learned, in the years since her mother died, to read her father's expressions with a precision that occasionally made him uncomfortable. "From work," he said, which was not exactly accurate, but was not exactly a lie either. Lily looked at him for another second, decided that was probably all she was going to get, and went back to her bibliography. Mason picked up his phone again. He read the email one more time. Outside the kitchen window, October had given way to November, and the city was doing what cities do when the warmth goes, contracting slightly, sharpening at the edges, becoming something a little more itself. He could hear the traffic on the street below, and the sound of the apartment building's heating system coming on for the first time this season, and Lily's pen moving across paper, and all of it was the ordinary furniture of the life he'd chosen, the life he'd protected, the life he would not trade. He thought about Vanessa's email for a long time. Then he typed a short reply. Vanessa had her answer back within the hour, which surprised her less than she expected. She'd half thought he might not respond at all, that the email might sit in some folder he checked once a week, that the careful distance he'd kept at Dunmore's might extend itself indefinitely. Instead, 3 words. "Tell me more." She typed for 40 minutes and deleted most of it twice before she settled on something that didn't sound like a pitch deck. She told him what she'd actually been thinking about since the coffee. Not a department inside her company, not a title with a budget attached to it, but something separate, something that didn't exist yet. A foundation built around a single idea, that most people who survive violence survive it by accident because nobody around them knew what to do, and that the gap between a room full of panicking civilians and a room full of people who'd been given even a few hours of the right training was enormous and almost entirely unaddressed. She wanted to build the thing that would have made the 11 minutes before Mason acted unnecessary. Or, if not unnecessary, survivable for more people in more places, led by more than one man who happened to be a former SEAL standing in the right line on the wrong morning. She didn't ask him to run it, she asked him to help her figure out if it was worth building. He wrote back 2 days later and asked to meet again. Well, they met at Dunmore's a second time, and then a third, and by the fourth meeting, Vanessa had stopped pretending to herself that this was purely a working relationship she was establishing out of professional interest in his expertise. She looked forward to it. She found herself thinking in the gaps of her day, in board meetings, in the back of cars, in the 4 minutes before falling asleep, about what he'd say about something. Not what her team would say. What he'd say. That bothered her a little, in the productive way things bother you when you're not ready to admit what they mean yet. Mason, for his part, was careful. Not cold. He showed up, he engaged, he gave real answers to real questions, and slowly the answers got longer and the silences between them got more comfortable. But he kept something back. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, filing it away without commentary. "You're doing the thing again," he said, on their fourth meeting, when she'd been quiet for a beat too long while he explained how a basic threat assessment training module should be structured. "What thing?" "Watching me like you're trying to find the seam." He said it without irritation, just observation. "I'm not hiding anything from you, Vanessa. I'm just careful about what I let into my life. It's not the same thing." "What's the difference?" "Hiding is about shame. Careful is about responsibility." He leaned back. "I've got a kid who depends on me showing up the same way every day. Whatever this becomes." He gestured loosely between them, between the laptop open on the table with her notes on it. "It has to fit around that, not the other way around." "I understand that. I know you understand it intellectually." He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you because I want you to actually feel it before we go further. Because if this works, if we build this thing, there are going to be moments where the company wants more from me than I'm willing to give, and I need you to be the person who holds that line instead of pushing against it." Vanessa sat with that. It was, she realized, a more vulnerable thing for him to say than anything else he'd told her. More than the details of Clara's death, more than the specifics of his service record, which Hartley's file had given her anyway, and which Mason discussed plainly when it came up, but never volunteered. This was him telling her what he needed from her if they were going to do this. It was an act of trust dressed up as a logistical point. "I'll hold the line," she said. "Okay." He nodded once, like a contract had been signed. "Then let's actually build something." The foundation took 4 months to incorporate properly. Vanessa's legal team handled the structural work while she and Mason hammered out the actual substance of what it would do. They called it Harbor Initiative, a name Mason suggested over a conversation about Clara, who used to say that the whole point of a harbor wasn't that the water was calm, it was that there was somewhere safe to come back to when it wasn't. Vanessa funded the first 18 months out of her own holdings, rather than running it through Holloway Group's balance sheet, which her CFO found strange, until she explained that she didn't want this thing to be a corporate social responsibility line item. She wanted it to be hers in a way that nothing else in her professional life had been entirely hers, separate from shareholders and quarterly performance and the particular gravity that money exerted on anything it touched. Mason consulted on curriculum design 2 evenings a week, after Lily's homework was done and before her bedtime, sitting at his kitchen table with his laptop and a legal pad, because he still thought better with a pen in his hand. He brought in 2 men from his old unit, Reyes, who'd done combat medicine and now ran emergency response training for a regional hospital network, and Okafor, who'd left the service to become a high school teacher and had spent the years since translating tactical thinking into language, a 14-year-old could absorb in a single class period. The three of them built something that didn't look like corporate training and didn't look like military instruction either. It looked like neither, on purpose. Mason was insistent on that point in a way that surprised Vanessa with its intensity. People shut down the second something feels like a drill, he told her, during a planning session in her office that ran 2 hours past when either of them had meant to stop. If it feels like the Army, civilians check out before the first slide finishes. We're not training soldiers. We're training a bank teller and a school janitor and a parent dropping their kid off, and they need something that fits into their actual lives, not a fantasy where they're suddenly capable of doing what I did. Then what are we training them to do? To notice, to not freeze, to know that there's always a next action, even a small one, even if it's just getting low and getting quiet and giving the person with a plan room to work. He tapped the legal pad. Most people who die in these situations don't die because they did something wrong. They die because nobody around them had ever once practiced what doing something looked like, even in their head. The brain does what it's rehearsed. If it's never rehearsed anything, it does nothing. And nothing is what gets people killed. Vanessa looked at the curriculum outline in front of her. Modules on situational awareness, basic medical intervention, de-escalation language, building evacuation logic, the kind of material that had never been taught to ordinary working adults in any structured way because nobody had built the bridge between military doctrine and civilian life until now. "This is good," she said. "This is genuinely good, Mason. It's a start." He didn't take the compliment the way most people in her orbit took compliments, expanding into them. He just nodded and moved to the next item. The first pilot program ran in March, 11 months after the bank, in a community center in a part of the city that didn't usually get this kind of resource. 40 participants, retail workers, a handful of teachers, 3 off-duty hospital staff, a retired postal worker who'd shown up because his daughter worked at a bank, and he'd read about Mason's story despite Mason's best efforts to stay out of the press. Mason taught the first session himself. Vanessa sat in the back, partly to observe and partly because she'd found, over the months of building this thing, that she didn't want to be anywhere else when he was teaching. He was different in front of a room than he'd been in the bank or at Dunmore's. Not performative. He was incapable of that, she'd decided. But more open, more willing to use his own voice as an instrument rather than holding it in reserve. He told them, plainly, that he'd been a hostage in a bank robbery the year before, that he'd had training most people in the room would never have access to, and that the entire point of the next 6 weeks was to give them a version of that training that fit into the lives they actually had. A woman in the second row, maybe 50, raised her hand. "What if we freeze anyway? Even after the training?" "You might," Mason said, without flinching from the honesty of it. "I'm not going to promise you this makes you bulletproof. What it does is give your brain something to grab onto instead of nothing. Even partial recall under stress is better than none. Even one step you remember is better than standing there with no idea what a step looks like." "Did you ever freeze?" the woman asked. "Before all your training?" Mason was quiet for a second. "Once, early on. I'll tell you about it next week when we talk about what fear actually does to decision-making, because it's a good example of what not to do, and I think it'll help more than a story where I get everything right." Vanessa watched the room lean toward him, not toward a hero, toward a man who'd admitted to failing once and had built a career and a life around making sure he understood exactly why, and who was now handing that understanding to a room of strangers for free. She thought, watching him, that she had built companies that made money and created jobs and moved markets in small ways, and that none of it had ever felt like this, like something that mattered in a way she could point to directly. A line from action to consequence that didn't pass through a quarterly earnings call first. After the session, while people filed out, Mason gathered his materials and Vanessa waited by the door. "That woman's question," she said, "about freezing. What about it? You're actually going to tell them about it next week. Whatever happened?" He nodded, packing his legal pad into his bag. "It's not something I talk about much, but if I'm asking 40 people to be honest about their fear, I should probably be honest about mine." "What happened?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she understood that this, whatever it was, belonged to the next session, to the room, to the structure he'd built where this kind of disclosure had a purpose beyond itself. "Next week," he said. "Come if you want to hear it." She came. It was a training exercise in his second year with the unit, he told the room the following Thursday, not a real operation. The worst day of his early career had not even been the kind of day that made it into any official record. A simulated close-quarters scenario that had gone sideways because of an equipment malfunction nobody had anticipated. And for about 4 seconds, in conditions that were supposed to be controlled and were briefly not, Mason had done nothing, not the wrong thing. Nothing. His brain had simply stopped issuing instructions to his body, and 4 seconds had felt, he said, like 4 years. Nobody got hurt, he told the room. It was a drill, and the safety protocols caught the malfunction before it became something worse. But I went back to my barracks that night, and I understood something about myself I hadn't understood before, which is that training doesn't make the fear go away. It gives the fear somewhere to go that isn't paralysis. I spent the next year making sure that 4 seconds never happened to me again. And it didn't, not in the years and the deployments that came after. But I never forgot what it felt like. He looked around the room. I'm telling you this because some of you are going to walk out of here in 6 weeks and think the goal was to never be afraid. That's not the goal. The goal is smaller and more honest than that. The goal is to be afraid and still have one true next step in your head when you need it. The retired postal worker, the one whose daughter worked at a bank, raised his hand. Is that what happened in the robbery? You had a next step? I had about 40 of them, Mason said. Most people only need one. The Harbor Initiative grew slowly and then, in the way these things sometimes did, less slowly. By the time the first full cohort graduated, 61 people across 2 pilot locations, word had moved through exactly the kind of channels that mattered most. Not press releases, but people telling other people that the training had actually changed something concrete about how safe they felt walking through their own days. A teacher in the second cohort used the de-escalation module to talk down a parent who'd come into the school in a state that everyone in the office had been too frightened to address directly. A retail worker recognized the early signs of a customer in mental health crisis and got 2 coworkers safely behind a register instead of letting the situation develop the way it might have a year earlier. None of it made the news. None of it was supposed to. Vanessa sat across from Mason one evening in late summer in her office after the building had mostly emptied out, going over enrollment numbers for the fall cohort, and she realized she was happier doing this than she had been doing almost anything else in the last decade of her professional life. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He looked up from the laptop. "Go ahead." "Why did you say yes to this? You turned down the security director job flat. No hesitation. But this..." She gestured at the room, at the folders, at the 11 months of work between them. "This took you, what, 2 days to consider?" He thought about it honestly, which was the thing she'd come to count on from him. The security job was about protecting one company. This is about teaching people to protect each other. He closed the laptop partway. "There's a difference between a job and a purpose, and I spent a long time after I left the service looking for something that felt like the second thing without costing me the first thing. My time with Lily. This is the only offer I've gotten since I got out that didn't ask me to choose between them." "I built it that way on purpose," Vanessa said. "I remembered what you told me at Dunmore's, about Clara, about not wanting to be the second parent a job took from her." Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, the way it rarely was with him, but enough that she caught it. "I noticed that," he said quietly. "I want you to know I noticed that." The office was quiet around them. Outside the window, the city had gone gold and orange with the last of the evening light, the particular hour where everything looks a little more generous than it usually does. "Vanessa," he said, and something in the way he said her name made her look up fully. "I need to say something, and I need you to know it's not about the foundation." She set down the folder in her hands. "Okay. I've spent the last year trying to keep this professional, mostly because I told myself that was the responsible thing to do, for Lily, for the work, for the fact that you're, frankly, not in my income bracket, and I didn't want this to ever look like something it wasn't." He held her gaze, steady in the way he held everything. "But I'm not good at lying to myself for very long, and I've been lying to myself about this for a while." Vanessa's pulse did something complicated. "About what specifically?" "About the fact that I think about you outside of working hours, that I look forward to Thursdays more than I should for someone who's just consulting on curriculum design, that my daughter asked me last week why I keep smiling at my phone, And I didn't have a good answer for her because the real answer was, you'd sent a text about something one of the trainees said, and it had nothing to do with anything important, and I read it 4 times anyway. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. I wasn't going to say anything, he continued, because I genuinely don't know how this works, professionally, ethically, practically. Lily, your company, the optics of it, all of it. But I've decided I'd rather be honest and let you decide what to do with it than keep being careful and resent myself for it. Vanessa stood up and walked around the desk, and he stood too, and for a moment they were just looking at each other in an office that had become, somewhere in the last 11 months, the place where the most honest version of her life happened to take place. "I've thought about you since the morning I watched you move that chair and didn't know what I was looking at," she said. "I came to Dunmore's the first time telling myself it was curiosity. It wasn't. I think I knew that by the second cup of coffee. What do we do with that?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never done this carefully before. I've done careers carefully. I've never done this." "Neither have I," he said. "Not since Clara." She reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had disarmed a man with a shotgun in under a second, the same hand that packed Lily's lunches and helped with bibliographies and held a coffee mug like he was trying not to need anything from anyone. "Then maybe we figure it out the way we figured out the foundation," she said, slowly, honestly, without pretending we know exactly where it ends. He looked down at their hands, then back up at her. "I can do slow," he said. "I've gotten good at slow the last few years." "I haven't," she admitted, "but I'm willing to learn." He almost laughed, a real one, brief and surprised out of him. "That sounds like you." "It is me," she said, "entirely for once, not the version of me that's careful about every room I walk into." Outside, the city kept doing what it did, indifferent and ongoing, the same as it had been the morning the doors blew open at First Meridian 11 months earlier, the same as it would be tomorrow when the fall cohort's first session began, and 40 more strangers walked into a room not yet knowing what they were capable of. Vanessa Holloway, 31 years old, who had built one of the fastest-growing companies in the country and had never once let herself want something this quietly, this completely, stood in her office holding the hand of a man who had once been invisible to her and had since become the thing she looked for first in every room she walked into. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. They didn't need to. There would be time, later, for everything that came next, for what Harbor Initiative would grow into, for what it would mean to build a life around each other without either of them losing the things that made them who they were. But for now, in an office gone gold with early evening light, it was enough to simply stand there, two people who had found something neither of them had been looking for, in a year that had started with the worst kind of morning and was ending with something that felt, for the first time in either of their lives in a long while, like the beginning of something steady. Part 3. Lưu ý cho viết 4.000 đến 4.500 từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sang. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Tri dân bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu.
Show more. It looks like part 3 was already delivered in my previous message. The section covering Harbor Initiative's founding, the pilot program, and Mason and Vanessa's confession in her office. The outline's actual part 3, The Navy SEAL returns, the climax inside the bank with the alarm, the takedown, the surrender, was the material I covered at the end of Part 1, since that's where the action chronologically belonged once Part 1 ran long with the full robbery sequence. To keep the 5-part structure clean and avoid repeating content, here's how the parts actually map so far. Part 1. The robbery, Mason's stillness, the climax and takedown, the surrender. Walking out Part 2. Vanessa's background check, Dunmore's, the security job offer and refusal, the Harbor Initiative idea taking root Part 3, just delivered, building Harbor Initiative, the pilot program, the confession in her office. That means what's left is the emotional deepening and the full resolution. Part 4, the relationship developing, obstacles, Vanessa learning what real leadership looks like. And Part 5, the 1-year mark, the training center opening, the ending. Do you want me to continue with Part 4 next, following that mapping? Or would you prefer I go back and restructure so Part 3 specifically covers new climax material instead? Let me know which you'd rather have, and I'll proceed accordingly. They didn't tell anyone right away. Vanessa had a policy, unspoken until she needed it, about keeping her personal life off the company's radar, and Mason had a more practical concern, which was Lily. He wasn't going to introduce a relationship into his daughter's life on a whim, no matter how steady it felt in the quiet of his own head. So for the first 2 months, what existed between him and Vanessa lived mostly in the spaces around the work. A hand resting on the small of her back as she leaned over a laptop, a phone call that started about curriculum logistics and ended 40 minutes later having covered almost nothing about curriculum logistics at all. A Saturday morning where she showed up at Dunmore's without an agenda for the first time, and they sat there for 2 hours talking about nothing that mattered and everything that did. It was Hartley who noticed first, because noticing things was his job and he was good at it. You're different around him, he told her, the way he'd tell her about a security vulnerability. Flat, observational, no judgment attached. Doesn't bother me. Just figured you'd want to know it's visible. How visible? Visible enough that I'm telling you, and I generally don't get involved in things that aren't my business. He paused. He's a good man, Vanessa. Background's clean as anyone I've ever pulled a file on. I'm not raising a concern. I'm just confirming you know you're not as subtle as you think you are. She'd laughed at that, which surprised her, because subtlety had been a professional asset she'd cultivated for 2 decades, and hearing that she'd lost her grip on it should have unsettled her more than it did. The harder conversation was the one with Lily, and Mason put it off longer than he meant to, the way he put off most things that involved exposing his daughter to anything that could go wrong. He'd spent 6 years building a life with exactly one source of instability removed from it. No unpredictable adults coming and going, no version of events where Lily had to manage someone else's feelings on top of her own. He wasn't going to break that pattern lightly. He brought it up on a Tuesday evening in October, almost exactly 1 year after the bank, while Lily was finishing a math worksheet at the kitchen table, and he was standing at the stove stirring something that didn't need that much stirring. I want to tell you something, he said, and I want you to feel like you can say whatever you actually think, not what you think I want to hear. Lily set down her pencil. She had a way of going very still when something important was coming. A stillness he recognized because it was, embarrassingly, the same stillness he did, and he'd never been sure if she'd learned it from him or if it was simply hers. Okay, she said. I've been spending time with someone. Vanessa, the woman from the bank, the one who's been working with me on Harbor. I know who Vanessa is, Dad. A flicker of something. Not hostility, more like she was waiting to see where this actually went before deciding how to feel about it. You talk about her a lot. You don't think you do, but you do. He set the spoon down. Is that a problem? Is it serious? I think it might be. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what it is yet, but I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from anywhere else, and I wanted to ask you how you feel about it instead of just telling you how it's going to be. Lily was quiet for a long moment, turning her pencil over in her fingers. Mom's been gone 6 years, she said finally, not as an accusation, just as a fact she was working something out against. I used to think if you found someone, I'd hate them automatically, like it would feel like Mom was getting replaced. Does it feel like that? No. She looked up at him.
Because you never acted like you were looking. You weren't dating random people or bringing people around just because you were lonely. You waited for somebody who actually mattered, and I think that's different. She paused. Does she know about Mom? Like, really know, not just the basic facts? She knows. We talk about her sometimes. Good. Lily nodded, decisive in the way only a 12-year-old fully committing to an opinion can be. Because if you'd found someone who wanted you to stop talking about Mom, I would have had a problem. But if she's somebody who lets Mom still be part of things, that's okay. That's actually good, Dad. He came around the table and sat down across from her. You're handling this better than I expected. I've had 6 years to think about it. She shrugged, but there was something underneath the casualness, something he recognized as her working hard to sound more settled than she fully was. I just want you to be careful. Not like careful. Just, I don't want to like her and then have it not work out and have both of us be sad about it. That's fair, he said. I don't want that either. Can I meet her? Whenever you want. Soon? He smiled. I'll ask her this week. The meeting happened at a diner instead of anywhere fancier, because Mason had been firm about that, and Vanessa, when he explained why, that Lily would read formality as pressure, that a casual place gave everyone room to just be people, had agreed without argument, which he noted as one more piece of evidence that she understood things faster than most people he'd worked with in any context, military or civilian. Lily showed up having clearly prepared. She had a list of questions in her head. Mason could tell by the particular set of her jaw, and about 6 minutes into the conversation, she started deploying them. Do you actually run the company, or do other people run it, and you just get credit? Vanessa didn't blink. I run it. I'm in meetings about it most of every day, which honestly sounds more impressive than it usually is. A lot of running a company is just listening to people argue about budgets. What's the worst decision you've ever made? Professionally or personally? Either. Vanessa thought about it seriously, which Mason noticed and appreciated. She wasn't performing an answer for a 12-year-old, she was actually considering it. I once fired someone who didn't deserve it because I was under pressure from someone above me, and I didn't push back hard enough to protect her. I've never forgotten it. I still think about her sometimes. Did you ever fix it? I tried. I helped her find another job, a better one actually, but I never got to undo the part where I let her get hurt to protect myself. That one stays. Vanessa met Lily's eyes without flinching from the discomfort of the admission. I try not to make that mistake again. Lily considered this with the seriousness of a judge weighing testimony. That's a real answer, she said, with something like approval. Most adults give a fake humble one, like, oh, I worked too hard, which isn't even a real mistake. I don't really do fake answers, Vanessa said. I find they waste everyone's time eventually anyway. By the end of the meal, Lily had relaxed considerably. Enough that she was explaining her ocean thermal energy project in more detail than either adult had asked for, and Vanessa was asking real follow-up questions instead of the polite kind adults usually offered children, and Mason sat back in the booth and watched the two most important things happening in his life exist in the same space without anything going wrong, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel fully in longer than he wanted to admit. In the parking lot afterward, while Vanessa was getting into her car, Lily tugged his sleeve. I like her, she said quietly. Yeah? She didn't try too hard. People who try too hard to get a kid to like them are usually hiding something. Lily looked at him very directly. She just talked to me like I was a person. That's rare. I think so too, Mason said. Are you going to marry her? Lily. I'm just asking. It's been 3 months. That's not a no. He didn't have an answer for that, and the fact that he didn't have an answer told him something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet, not even to himself. The relationship survived its first real test 6 weeks later, and it came from a direction neither of them had braced for. A financial journalist working a story on Holloway Group's unconventional philanthropic spending had stumbled onto the Harbor Initiative's funding structure and, in digging for an angle, had found Mason's name attached to the foundation's curriculum design. From there, it had taken him less than a day to connect the dots back to the bank robbery, to Mason's service record, to the relationship that he correctly intuited existed between the foundation's founder and the man teaching its first cohorts. The story ran with a headline that made Mason's stomach drop the first time he saw it. CEO's Secret Hero, Inside the Romance Behind Holloway's New Foundation. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was reductive. It took 11 years of service and turned it into a meet cute. It took a foundation built to give ordinary people a fighting chance into the kind of human interest sidebar that made the actual work sound like decoration on a love story. Mason called Vanessa the moment he saw it, and she was already 3 calls deep into damage control with her communications team. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I should have anticipated this. I should have had a plan in place before it became necessary. I'm not calling because I'm angry at you." He kept his voice level, though it cost him something to do it. "I'm calling because Lily's school has a copy of the article in 3 different group chats by lunchtime, and I need you to understand what that does to a 12-year-old. "What can I do?" "Nothing today. There's nothing to do today except let it run its course." He exhaled. "But I need you to understand something. I didn't sign up for this. I signed up to build a curriculum and teach people how to survive bad days. I didn't sign up to be a headline, and I definitely didn't sign Lily up for it." "I know. Do you? Because this is exactly the thing I told you about, back at the beginning, the line I asked you to hold." His voice had an edge now, restrained but present, the first real friction either of them had introduced into this. "I'm not blaming you for a journalist doing his job badly, but I need to know you understand why this matters more to me than a bad news cycle matters to you." There was a long pause on her end. "You're right," she said finally, "and I want to be honest with you instead of just apologizing reflexively, because I think you'd respect that more. I didn't think about Lily enough when I let this relationship become something visible. I was thinking about us. I wasn't thinking carefully enough about what visibility cost the people who didn't choose it. That's the part that actually scares me," Mason said, quieter now. "Not the article. The fact that there's going to be more of this if we keep going, and some of it's going to land on a kid who's already lost one parent and didn't sign up for any of the rest of it." "What do you want to do?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I want to figure out how to protect her without ending this. I don't want to end this, Vanessa, but I need you to actually mean it when you said you'd hold the line, and I need to see you do it, not just hear you say it." "Then let me show you," she said. "Give me a week." What Vanessa did over the following week was something Mason hadn't expected and that genuinely impressed him, not because it solved everything, but because of what it cost her to do it. She restructured the foundation's public communications entirely, pulled her own name out of the press materials wherever it wasn't structurally necessary, redirected every press inquiry toward Harbor's actual graduates and their stories instead of toward her or Mason, and personally called the journalist who'd written the piece and had a conversation that the journalist later described, off the record, as the most direct dressing down he'd received in 15 years of business journalism. Not angry, just precise, laying out exactly what the story had cost a child who had no public profile and no say in any of it. She didn't ask for a retraction. She asked for something more useful, a follow-up piece written with her cooperation that focused entirely on Harbor's first cohort and the measurable difference the training had made, with her own role minimized to a sentence and Mason's name left out of it altogether unless he chose otherwise. The follow-up ran 3 weeks later. It did more for Harbor's credibility and funding pipeline than the original story had done damage, and it mentioned neither romance nor Mason's name. When he saw it, he called her. "You actually did it," he said. "I told you I would. A lot of people tell me things." He let that sit for a second. Not many of them actually follow through when it costs them something. "It cost me a news cycle, where I would have looked good for being generous and visionary. I decided I'd rather protect your daughter than look good." She paused. "That's not a hard trade for me, Mason. I want you to know that. It was never close." He believed her. That was the thing that mattered. Not the action itself, though the action mattered plenty, but the fact that when he tested whether she meant what she said, she'd met the test without flinching. "Lily asked about you again last night," he said. "Wanted to know if you were coming to her science fair." "When is it?" 3 weeks, Saturday morning." "I'll be there." "You don't have to commit before checking your calendar." "I already checked it. I'll be there." A small pause, and he could hear something soften in her voice. I want to be there, Mason. Not because it's a gesture, because I actually want to see what she's been working on. She talked about that ocean project for 45 minutes at dinner. I want to see if it's as impressive as it sounded. It's more impressive than it sounded, he said. She undersold it because she's embarrassed about how into it she is. That's the most likable thing I've heard all week, said. The science fair was, by Lily's own later assessment, fine, I guess. Second place isn't terrible. Though Mason suspected she was prouder of the project than she was letting on. And Vanessa spent 20 minutes at the display board asking pointed, genuinely curious questions that had nothing to do with being polite to her boyfriend's kid and everything to do with actually wanting to understand the science, until Lily was animated in a way Mason hadn't seen since before Clara died. Fully herself, unguarded, talking too fast about thermocline gradients to someone who was keeping up with her instead of nodding along. Driving home that evening, Lily was quiet in the back seat for a while, and then she said, without preamble, "She gets it, Dad." "Gets what?" "That I'm not just a kid she has to be nice to. She actually listens." Lily looked out the window. "Mom used to do that. Listen like the thing you were saying actually mattered, not just because she was supposed to." Mason kept his eyes on the road because he needed a second before he trusted his voice. "Yeah," he said finally. "She does that." "I'm glad you found her," Lily said, quiet and certain, the way only a child telling the truth without performing it can sound. "I think Mom would be glad too." He didn't say anything for a long moment. The city moved past the windows, ordinary and unremarkable the way it always was. The same city that had held a bank robbery and a Foundation's first pilot program and a science fair where his daughter had finally, fully exhaled. "I think so too," he said. By the time they pulled into the apartment lot, something had settled in him that had been unsettled since the article ran. Not because the danger was gone, because there would always be more of it, more headlines, more moments where the life he'd built collided with the life Vanessa had built, and produced friction neither of them could fully control. But because he tested whether she'd hold the line when it actually cost her something, and she had, without complaint and without making it about her own discomfort. That was the thing he'd learned to look for in 11 years of service, long before he ever met a CEO in a bank lobby. Not whether someone said the right things when nothing was at stake, whether they did the right thing when something was. Vanessa Holloway had passed that test. He was beginning to think she might keep passing it for as long as he gave her the chance to. Winter passed, and then the slow thaw of a second spring since the bank, and the work kept growing the way real things grow, unevenly, with setbacks that didn't make it into anyone's summary of how well things were going. A cohort in the second city they expanded to lost half its enrollment in the first 2 weeks because the curriculum needed translating into a different cultural register than the one Mason and Reyes and Okafor had built it in originally, and they spent a frustrating month tearing apart material they'd been proud of and rebuilding it from a more honest starting point. A donor Vanessa had courted for months pulled out after deciding the Foundation's mission was too niche to matter at scale. And she'd had to sit with that rejection without being able to argue him out of it, because some people were never going to understand what this was for until they saw it work on someone they loved. None of it was smooth. Mason had told her early on back at Dunmore's that he didn't trust anything that looked smooth and finished too fast, and the Foundation kept proving him right. Curriculum modules had to be rewritten twice. A training site flooded the week before a cohort's graduation, and they ran the final session in a rented gymnasium with bad acoustics and Mason shouting half his lesson over the echo. 2 of the early instructors they'd hired didn't have the patience for civilian students and had to be let go, an uncomfortable process that Vanessa handled herself because she'd learned from watching Mason operate that the hard conversations were the ones you didn't delegate. But it grew anyway. By the following autumn, Harbor Initiative had run training cohorts in 4 cities, with a 5th in planning, and the data Vanessa's team had started collecting, informal at first, then more rigorous as the Foundation matured, showed something that neither of them had been able to prove with certainty when they started, but had believed instinctively from the first conversation at Dunmore's. People who went through even a partial version of the training responded faster and more usefully in real emergencies than people who hadn't. Not heroically, just usefully. A graduate in the third cohort had used a tourniquet improvised from a belt to keep a coworker alive after a workplace accident until paramedics arrived, a skill she'd practiced exactly once, in a 6-week course, on a mannequin's arm in a community center basement. She hadn't frozen. She'd had one true next step, the way Mason always said the goal was, and it had been enough. That story reached Mason secondhand through Reyes, and he sat with it for a long time before he told Vanessa about it, because it confirmed something he hadn't let himself fully hope for, that the thing they were building actually worked, not in theory, not in pilot program enthusiasm, but in the unglamorous, unrecorded moments where it mattered most. "This is what I wanted," he told her, the night he finally told her the story, sitting on the worn couch in his apartment with Lily's homework still spread across the kitchen table from earlier. Not credit, not a headline, just proof that it works when nobody's watching. "It's working because you built it to work," Vanessa said. "I funded it. You're the one who figured out what people actually needed. We built it together." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to stop doing the thing where you minimize your part in this. You didn't just write checks, Vanessa. You sat in the back of that first session. You called that journalist. You've shown up for every single thing I've asked you to show up for, including the ones that cost you something. That's not funding. That's building." She didn't have a quick response to that, which had become rarer between them the longer they'd known each other. Not because she'd run out of things to say, but because she'd learned from him that not every moment needed to be filled with words. Sometimes the better response was just to sit in it. The proposal, when it came, was not the production Vanessa might once have imagined for herself, back when she was the kind of person who thought about these milestones in terms of optics and timing and how a thing would be perceived. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in March, almost 2 years to the week since the bank, in his kitchen, while Lily was at a sleepover and the apartment was quiet, in the particular way it only got when she wasn't home. He didn't kneel. He told her later that he'd thought about it and decided it wasn't them. Too much performance for two people who'd built everything between them out of plainness and follow-through. Instead, he just set a small box on the table between them while she was finishing the dishes, and when she turned around and saw it, she set the dish towel down very slowly. "I've thought about this a lot," he said, "and I decided the only thing worth saying is the true thing, not the practice thing. I spent 6 years building a life that didn't need anyone else in it because I didn't trust myself to risk Lily's stability on someone who might not stay. You've stayed. Through the article, through every hard week of the foundation, through every time I asked you to hold a line that cost you something. I don't have a speech. I just know I don't want to keep building toward anything without you actually being part of it permanently. Not as a partner in the foundation's paperwork, but as my partner. As Lily's, for real." Vanessa looked at the box, then at him, and something in her chest that had been carefully, professionally managed for almost 2 decades simply gave way. "Yes," she said, before he'd even technically finished asking, which made him laugh. A full laugh, rare and unguarded, the kind she'd come to treasure precisely because it was rare. "I didn't even get to the question yet." "I know what the question was." She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him. "I've known the answer for a while." Lily's reaction, when they told her the following morning, was characteristically direct. She looked at the ring on Vanessa's hand, looked at her father, and said, "Finally," with the exact tone of a person who had been waiting on slower adults to catch up to something she'd already worked out for herself. "You're not surprised," Mason said. "Dad, you've been doing the smiling at your phone thing for 2 years. I'm not surprised. I'm relieved you finally did something about it." She hugged Vanessa, briefly and without ceremony, the way she did most things. "Can I be there when you tell people? I want to see everyone's faces." They were married in June, in a small ceremony that Vanessa insisted be modest by her own world standards and lavish by Mason's, a contradiction they'd negotiated with the same patient back and forth they brought to everything, landing on a backyard gathering with 40 guests. Reyes and Okafor standing as groomsmen, Lily as the most visibly emotional person in attendance despite her best efforts to maintain composure, and Dave, the neighbor, giving a toast about football that somehow worked its way around to being genuinely moving by the end. Vanessa did not change her name, and Mason had never expected her to. What changed instead was something harder to put into a single sentence, the shape of two separate lives folding into something that held both without erasing either. She kept running Holloway Group with the same intensity she always had, but she'd learned slowly to let it occupy less of the space in her that used to be entirely consumed by it. He kept his job at Caro Freight for another 8 months after the wedding, not because he needed the income anymore, but because he wasn't ready to let go of the version of himself that had built a quiet, ordinary life out of nothing, until the day came when Harbor Initiative's growth genuinely required him full-time, and he made that transition on his own terms, in his own timing, never pushed. The 1-year anniversary of the bank robbery had passed quietly, almost unmarked, back when Mason and Vanessa were still keeping their relationship mostly private. The second anniversary was different. It fell 3 months after the wedding, and by then Harbor Initiative had trained over 4,000 people across 6 cities. And Vanessa had an idea she'd been sitting on for months, one she finally brought to Mason on a Sunday morning over coffee that had gone cold while they talked. "I want to build something permanent," she said. "Not another rented community center. A real facility. A crisis response training center, purpose-built, with simulation environments, medical training bays, a proper auditorium for the kind of session you ran that first day. Something that says this isn't temporary, this isn't a pilot program anymore. This is infrastructure. That's a significant capital commitment. I know what it costs. I've run the numbers 4 different ways." She looked at him. "I want to open it on the anniversary, not because the date matters to the public. Most people have forgotten the robbery happened at all by now. But because it matters to us. I want to walk into a building on the day that started all of this and know we built something that outlasts the headline." Mason thought about it the way he thought about everything important, slowly turning it over, checking it from angles she hadn't considered yet. Lily would want to be there, all the way through, not just for a ribbon-cutting photo. She'll be there for everything. I already promised her she gets to help pick the colors for the training bay walls. Reyes and Okafor need to be part of the leadership structure permanently, not consulting. They've earned that. Already drafted the offer letters. He looked at her, something warm and unguarded in his expression. "You've thought about all of it." "I think about all of it," she said. "That's the job." The construction took 10 months, through a winter that delayed things twice, and a budget overrun that Vanessa absorbed without complaint, because she'd decided, somewhere along the way, that this particular project didn't get to be compromised by the ordinary pressures she applied to everything else she funded. Mason walked the site every week, in boots that had replaced the worn pair from the bank years ago, but carried the same unhurried economy of movement, checking sight lines and room flow with the same instinct he'd once used to read a bank lobby full of armed men. The building that emerged on a plot of land in a part of the city that had needed investment for a long time was not ostentatious. Vanessa had pushed for something architecturally striking, and Mason had pushed back gently but firmly, arguing that the people this place was for, retail workers, teachers, parents, the same ordinary working people who'd filled that first community center 2 years earlier, needed to walk in and feel like the building belonged to them, not like they were visiting somewhere that belonged to wealth. They'd compromised on something clean and warm, brick and glass, with a mural on the entrance wall that Lily had a hand in designing, depicting hands reaching toward each other across a doorway, plain enough to be read by anyone, hopeful enough to mean something to people who'd lived through their own version of a bad day. They named it the Harbor Center, no surnames attached, despite the pressure from Vanessa's board to put the Holloway name somewhere on the building for the obvious reputational value. She refused outright, the one time in the entire process that she didn't even bring the question to Mason for discussion, because she already knew what he'd say and didn't need him to say it. The opening was held on a Saturday morning in October, 2 years to the week since the doors of First Meridian had blown open, and the guest list reflected exactly what the foundation had become rather than what either of them had been before it. Graduates from every cohort, families of people who'd used the training in moments that mattered, Reyes and Okafor standing at the front with their new titles finally official, Earl the security guard, fully recovered, who'd kept in touch over the years and asked to come, Priya the teller, who'd gone back to school for emergency management and credited the bank robbery, oddly enough, with showing her what she wanted to do with her life. Gerald, the branch manager, came too, older now, steady steadier than he'd been that terrified morning in the lower vault room, and he found Mason near the entrance before the ceremony started. "I never properly thanked you," Gerald said. "I was so scared that day I barely processed what you were doing. I just knew somehow it was going to be okay because you seemed to know something the rest of us didn't." "You did fine that day," Mason said. "Scared people who keep functioning anyway are the ones who actually get others through it. You kept talking. You kept giving them information. That mattered more than you think." Gerald looked like he might say something else, then simply shook Mason's hand instead, longer than a handshake usually lasts, and walked toward his seat. The retired postal worker from the very first pilot cohort was there too, with his daughter, the one who worked at a bank, the reason he'd shown up to that first session in the first place. She'd since left banking and now worked as a harbor initiative instructor herself, training the next round of ordinary people to be slightly less powerless than the room had been on the worst day of her father's worry. Lily stood near the front with the particular posture of a 14-year-old determined not to cry in public and failing steadily as the morning went on. She'd grown taller in the 2 years since the bank, had her mother's laugh fully settled into her now, had opinions about almost everything and a fierce, protective love for both the parents standing in front of her, the one she'd always had and the one who'd earned her trust slowly instead of demanding it. Vanessa spoke first, brief and unsentimental, in the way she'd learned over the years that Mason respected more than Flourish. She talked about what Harbor had become, the numbers, the cities, the graduates whose stories she'd been collecting and was careful never to use without their permission. She talked about funding and infrastructure and the practical machinery of building something that would outlast either of them. Then she said the things she'd actually come to say. "I used to believe that power was the thing that kept people safe. I built a company on that belief, more or less. The idea that if you accumulate enough leverage, enough resources, enough control over outcomes, you insulate yourself and the people around you from the worst things that can happen. I was 31 years old, and I thought I understood what mattered." She paused, looked out at the crowd, found Mason's eyes briefly before continuing. 2 years ago, I was on my knees on a marble floor with a shotgun pointed at the back of my head, and every form of power I'd ever built meant absolutely nothing in that room. What saved that room, what saved 37 lives, including mine, wasn't power. It was a man most of us hadn't bothered to notice, who'd spent years learning how to be calm inside chaos, and had decided, long before that morning, that he'd rather be quietly capable than visibly important. She let that sit for a moment. "I think most of us go through our lives sorting people the way I sorted that bank lobby, by what we can see on the surface, the suits, the titles, the things that signal status in whatever world we move through. We miss the people who actually matter because they're not performing for our attention. Mason taught me that real strength rarely announces itself. It shows up quietly, does the work, and goes home to make dinner. I built this center because I never want another room full of frightened people to have to depend on luck, on whether or not there happens to be a Mason rider standing in line that day. I want there to be more people in every room who know what to do, who've practiced the one true next step, even if they never have to use it." She looked at the crowd, at the graduates and the families and the people whose lives had been quietly, permanently altered by 6 weeks of training they'd almost talked themselves out of attending. "That's the whole point of this place. Not heroes, just readiness. Just enough ordinary courage spread across enough ordinary people that the next bad day costs less than it could have." Mason spoke last, and he kept it shorter than Vanessa had, because that was who he was. But what he said landed harder for its plainness. "I spent 11 years being trained to handle the worst 5 minutes of other people's lives," he said. "I came home from that work because I had a daughter who needed a father more than the world needed another operator. And for a long time I thought that meant I was done with the only thing I'd ever been good at. I was wrong about that. I just hadn't found the right shape for it yet." He looked out at the crowd, found Lily near the front, found the slight, unembarrassed nod she gave him. "People ask me sometimes why I did what I did that morning, why I didn't just keep my head down, wait for it to be over, go home to my kid like everyone else in that room was praying to do. The honest answer is that I'd spent years training myself to believe that if I had the ability to stop something terrible and I stayed silent, I'd be choosing to let it happen. That's not heroism. That's just math, the kind I'd had drilled into me since I was 18 years old. If I do nothing and someone dies, that's on me as much as on the person who pulled the trigger. He paused. What I didn't expect was what came after. I didn't expect a woman from that bank lobby to spend 2 years building something that takes what I happen to know and gives it to people who never had the chance to learn it. I didn't expect to fall in love doing it. I didn't expect my daughter to end up with someone who actually listens to her the way her mother used to. None of that was part of any plan I had. It just happened, the way good things sometimes happen when you're busy doing the next right thing and not looking for credit. He looked at the building behind him. The brick, the glass, the mural of hands reaching toward each other. This place isn't about what happened to us. It's about what doesn't have to happen to the next person if enough of us are willing to learn something before the worst day comes instead of after. That's the whole lesson, if there is one. You don't have to be a SEAL. You don't have to be fearless. You just have to be willing to know one true next step and willing to take it when the moment actually arrives. That's available to anyone. That's the only thing I actually want people walking out of this building believing. Quite. After the ceremony, while the crowd moved through the building, touring the simulation bays and the medical training rooms and the auditorium where the first session of the next cohort would begin in 2 weeks, Mason found a quiet corner near the entrance mural and stood there for a moment, looking at the painted hands reaching toward each other across the doorway. Vanessa found him there. Lily found them both a moment later, drawn by the kind of instinct children develop for locating their parents in a crowd, and the three of them stood together without saying much, watching strangers move through a building that existed because of one terrible morning that had, against every reasonable expectation, become the beginning of something good. "You okay?" Vanessa asked him quietly. "Yeah," Mason said, "just thinking about how close all of this came to not happening. If I'd been in line 10 minutes earlier, if Lily's appointment had been at a different time, if you'd been at a different branch that day." "Don't do that to yourself," Vanessa said. "We don't get to know all the ways it could have gone wrong. We only get to know how it actually went." He nodded slowly, and something in him that had carried a low, persistent weight since that morning 2 years ago. The residue of action under pressure, the part of him that still occasionally replayed those 0.6 of a second in the stairwell, finally settled into something closer to peace. "It went right," he said. "Eventually. Most of it went right." "All the parts that mattered," Vanessa said, and slipped her hand into his. Lily, on his other side, leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, the way she used to when she was smaller and the world felt larger than she could manage alone. And for a moment, the three of them simply stood there, in a building built out of fear transformed into purpose, while behind them a new group of ordinary people filed into an auditorium to learn, in whatever small and unglamorous way the world allowed, how to be a little less powerless the next time their own bad day arrived. Outside, the October light fell across the city the same way it always had, indifferent to all of it, the robbery and the romance and the years of quiet work in between. And somewhere in that ordinary afternoon, a city kept moving, mostly unaware that 2 years earlier, in a downtown bank that still operated 3 blocks from where they now stood, a single father in worn boots had decided that silence, in the face of something he could stop, was its own kind of failure. And because of that decision, made in less time than it takes to finish a breath, an entire building now existed to make sure fewer people would ever have to find out, the hard way, whether they had a Mason rider standing beside them when it mattered. Some of them would. Most of them, statistically, would not. But because of the work being done inside that building, more of them than ever before would at least know what to do with the seconds they had. And in the end, that was the whole of what either of them had ever wanted to give. Not a story about 2 extraordinary people, but proof that ordinary people, given the right preparation and just enough courage, could be the thing someone else needed on the worst day of their life. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. And it was finally enough.